Welcome to the deep dive. Sometimes you think of history, especially church history, as maybe a bit dry.
Uh-huh.
Well, prepare for a surprise today. We're digging into a time when the papacy, the very center of the church, was acting in ways that honestly might shock you. And it really helps understand why things shifted so drastically later.
That's absolutely right. Today we're diving into what some historians like Barbara Tuchman might call the folly of the papacy, specifically in the period running up to the Protestant Reformation.
Right.
Our goal here is to see how the church's spiritual mission got tangled up with worldly power, politics, sometimes even scandal,
Yeah.
and how that created, well, the perfect conditions for the Reformation to ignite.
And we've got some really interesting sources to guide us. We have a church history study, which gives us the academic view.
Yep.
Then there are Wikipedia pages, giving the lowdown on things like anti-popes and some, let's say, memorable popes.
Memorable is one word for them.
We've also got a magazine piece reflecting on bad popes from a more modern angle, a book excerpt bluntly titled The Criminal History of the Papacy.
Doesn't pull any punches, that one.
Yeah. Then an academic article comparing historical crises in the church to more recent ones, and even a Reddit discussion about the Papal States going to war. So a real mix.
It's a great mix because it gives us different angles. And what jumps out almost immediately looking across these is this blurring line between the church's spiritual job and its role in, well, earthly power.
Okay, explain that a bit.
Well, the church history source points out that after the Roman Empire collapsed in the West, there was this huge power vacuum.
Right, makes sense.
And the church, particularly the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, gradually stepped into that void. Over time, this led to the creation of the Papal States.
So the Pope became a ruler, like a king.
Exactly. Not just a spiritual leader, but a temporal ruler with land, subjects, armies, the whole package.
That's a massive change, isn't it?
Yeah.
From focusing on souls to managing territories.
It is. And this is where that idea of the March of Folly comes in. Tuchman uses it to describe situations where institutions pursue policies contrary to their own interests.
So how does it apply here?
Well, the argument is that the papacy started prioritizing secular goals, political games, military campaigns, building wealth often over its core spiritual mission.
And you can imagine the average person.
Right. If you're looking for salvation, for spiritual guidance, and you see the church leadership acting like just another feudal lord.
It must have been bewildering. Or worse.
Deeply confusing. It created a real disconnect between the hierarchy and the faithful.
Okay, so that's the backdrop. Let's talk about a specific early example of this tangle.
Yeah.
The investiture controversy. What was that fight about?
The investiture controversy. This was a big one, mainly in the 11th and 12th centuries. The core issue was who gets to appoint bishops and abbots.
The church or the king?
Essentially, yes. In theory, it was the church's right. But in practice, emperors and kings often invested these church officials with the symbols of their office, basically controlling the appointments.
Because these weren't just religious roles, were they?
Not at all. Bishops and abbots controlled huge amounts of land and wealth. They were powerful feudal lords in their own right. So kings wanted loyal men in those positions.
And this ties into the feudal system.
Absolutely. Feudalism meant power was quite decentralized. Local lords, including kings and emperors, often had more immediate influence over local churches than distant Rome did.
Which led to problems like simony. I've heard that term.
Exactly. Simony, the buying and selling of church offices, it became rampant. Both the secular rulers and, frankly, parts of the church hierarchy saw it as a source of revenue.
So you could literally buy your way into being a bishop.
Pretty much. Which, as you can imagine, didn't always lead to the most spiritually qualified candidates getting the job.
I bet. And our source mentioned that bishops were often nobles anyway.
Yes, that was very common. Nobles often had the education, the administrative skills needed to run these large estates. Plus, appointing nobles kept these powerful positions within the ruling class families.
So it wasn't just about spiritual leadership at all.
Often, that seemed secondary. It was about power, land, and loyalty.
Can you give us a concrete example of this conflict exploding?
The classic case is Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. He insisted on appointing his own guy as Bishop of Milan, defying Pope Gregory VII.
And the Pope didn't take that lightly.
Not at all. Gregory VII hit back hard. In 1076, he excommunicated Henry and declared him deposed, basically, fired as emperor.
Wow. Did that work?
Well, it caused chaos. It didn't immediately remove Henry, but it gave the German princes, who were often looking for excuses to gain more power, the justification they needed. They rebelled, seized royal lands. It seriously weakened the emperor's position.
So a fight over a bishopric turns into a major political crisis. Was it the same everywhere? What about England?
England had its own version with Henry VI, but the outcome was a bit different. The Pope needed England's support against the German emperor at the time, so they reached a compromise sooner.
A compromise.
Yes, the Concordat of London in 1107. It basically distinguished between the bishop's spiritual role and his role as a landholder. The church would invest him with spiritual authority, but he'd swear loyalty to the king for his lands, his temporalities.
Ah, okay. So a kind of separation, but still tied together.
Exactly. And this model influenced the later Concordat of Worms, settling the issue in the empire too. It created a system where bishops were kind of servants of two masters, and that system, amazingly, lasted for almost 450 years.
450 years. That really shows how deeply entwined church and state became. Okay, let's jump forward a bit. The Avignon Schism in the 14th century. How did we get to a point where there were multiple popes?
Well, by the early 1300s, the papacy was neck-deep in European politics. Pope Boniface VIII went so far as to claim universal authority over kings and emperors in both spiritual and temporal matters.
That sounds like picking a fight.
It certainly picked one with Philip IV of France. Philip wanted to tax the French clergy and stop French money flowing to Rome. Boniface said, absolutely not.
And things got dramatic.
Extremely. Philip's men, led by Guillaume de Nogaret, actually stormed the papal residence in Anagni and arrested Pope Boniface.
Arrested the Pope.
Yes. He was freed after a few days, but the shock and humiliation likely contributed to his death soon after.
Unbelievable. And the instability continued.
It did. Boniface's successor, Benedict XI, excommunicated Nogaret but then died suddenly himself. Rumors swirled that he'd been poisoned.
Poison. This sounds less like church leadership and more like, I don't know, Game of Thrones.
The comparison isn't entirely unfair for certain periods. This instability led to a contested election. An Italian, Urban VI, was elected in Rome, but the French cardinals felt pressured, declared the election invalid, and elected their own pope, Clement VII, who set up shop back in Avignon, France.
And that's the Western Schism.
That's the start of it. In 1378, for almost 40 years, you had two, and sometimes even three, men claiming to be the one true pope.
3 popes. How did people even know who to follow?
It often split along national lines. France and its allies supported the Avignon Pope. England, the Holy Roman Empire, and others supported the Roman Pope. It was a political mess that deeply damaged the church's prestige and authority.
How did it finally end?
It took a major church council, the Council of Constance, which finally managed to depose or accept the resignations of the rival claimants and elect a single new pope, Martin V, in 1417. But the damage was done.
You can see why people might start thinking the church needed serious reform. Were there movements pushing for that even before Luther?
Oh, absolutely. The calls for reform weren't new in the 16th century. Way back in the late 14th century in England, you had John Wycliffe.
And his followers, the Lollards.
Exactly. Lollard was kind of a derogatory term, often meaning uneducated, mumbling folks. But they were energized by Wycliffe's ideas and, crucially, by having the Bible translated into English.
What were Wycliffe and the Lollards arguing for?
They believed the church had become corrupted by wealth and power. They looked to the Bible as the ultimate authority, not necessarily church tradition or the Pope.
So direct access to Scripture was key for them.
Very key. And they had specific criticisms, too, laid out in things like their 12 conclusions.
What kind of things?
Things like church leaders shouldn't hold temporal power or wealth. They questioned doctrines like transubstantiation in the Eucharist. They criticized venerating images, pilgrimages, even prayers for the dead. They advocated for priests being allowed to marry and argued against the necessity of confessing sins to a priest. Some even pushed for a sort of priesthood of all believers.
That sounds radical for the time.
Yeah.
Very similar to what the later reformers would say.
Extremely similar. They were really challenging the foundations of the medieval church structure.
And there was Jan Hus in Bohemia around the same time.
Yes, Jan Hus was deeply influenced by Wycliffe. He preached in the vernacular, Czech, and echoed many of the same criticisms about church wealth, corruption, and papal authority.
And this was happening while the schism was still going on.
Right. Hus was particularly critical of the idea that the Pope could wage war or sell indulgences, payments to forgive sin. He stressed personal repentance. Remember, the Council of Pisa in 1409 tried to fix the schism, but just ended up electing a third pope.
What a mess.
Yeah,
So Hus is criticizing folks, including one of these anti-popes, John XXIII.
correct. And his emphasis on repentance over buying forgiveness with indulgences. Well, that's a theme we'll definitely come back to.
It seems like besides these popular movements, there were also attempts to reform the church structure from within, like conciliarism.
Yes, conciliarism was a major movement within the church, born directly out of the crisis of the Western Schism.
What was the idea?
The core idea was that the highest authority in the church wasn't the pope alone, but an ecumenical council, a gathering of all the bishops.
Like the Council of Constance that ended the schism.
Exactly. Conciliarists argued that a council could make binding decisions, even judge or depose a pope if necessary. They pointed to early church history, where councils settled major doctrinal issues. It was an attempt to put a check on papal power.
So a check from within the hierarchy. And what about Gallicanism?
Gallicanism was a related, but more specifically French idea. It asserted that the French church had certain historical liberties or a degree of independence from direct papal control.
Was that really true, historically?
The historical basis was a bit shaky. While they might cite figures like Gregory the Great, the French church had generally acknowledged papal authority. But it became a useful political argument for the French monarchy and clergy wanting to limit papal interference, especially concerning appointments and finances.
Okay, so we have popular dissent, internal debates about authority. It feels like the stage is set for major conflict. Now let's zoom in on those popes right before the Reformation, the six leading up to Leo X. Our sources are pretty blunt about them, starting with Sixtus V.
Sixtus IV, Pope from 1471 to 1484, came in with a reputation for piety, being a Franciscan. But his papacy became defined by absolutely rampant nepotism. He made numerous nephews cardinals, gave relatives huge positions. We're talking about appointing an 8-year-old as Archbishop of Lisbon, an 11-year-old for Milan.
8 years old.
Yeah.
An archbishop.
Yep. His court was incredibly lavish. Now, he did good things too. Restored the Vatican Library, patronized arts. Sixtus is the Sixtus of the Sistine Chapel, its initial phase.
But that costs money.
A fortune.
Yeah.
That, plus his wars in Italy, maybe even involvement in plots like the Papacy conspiracy against the Medici, it required huge sums. And sources say European rulers were pleading with him to reform the church towards the end, but nothing happened.
Just focused on family and power.
It certainly looks that way. Prioritizing family fortunes over spiritual leadership seems to be the theme.
Okay, next up. Innocent VIII, 1484 to 1492. What's his story?
Innocent VIII was perhaps most famous for openly acknowledging his illegitimate children. He even threw lavish weddings for them in the Vatican, apparently mortgaging papal treasures to pay for it.
Mortgaging treasures for his kid's wedding.
Seems so. And corruption reportedly hit new highs. Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia, the next pope, was a key figure, allegedly running a massive trade in selling offices, pardons even for murder, forging papal documents.
It sounds completely out of control.
The sources paint a picture of the College of Cardinals becoming deeply degraded, and Innocent VIII is the one who made Giovanni de' Medici, the future Pope Leo X, a cardinal at age 16.
16?
Yes. Even Giovanni's father, Lorenzo the Magnificent, wrote a famous letter warning his young son about the cesspool of corruption he was entering in Rome.
Wow. Even the secular rulers knew how bad it was, and Innocent VIII apparently pleaded for a better successor on his deathbed.
The irony is thick, isn't it? He knew how bad things were, perhaps contributed significantly, and hoped for better after him.
Which brings us to Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, 1492-1503. His name is infamous.
Infamous is right. Rodrigo Borgia. Our sources suggest there are very few defenders of his papacy. Borgia basically became shorthand for corruption, nepotism, and debauchery.
Was he really that bad?
Well, it's widely believed he bought the papacy through simony bribing cardinals.
Bought the papacy?
That's the accusation, and his actions afterwards certainly fit. He openly acknowledged his children, particularly Cesare and Lucrezia, from his long-term mistress Fannozza de Catani, and later had a relationship with the young Giulia Farnese.
And he used his children politically.
Absolutely. He used their marriages to forge alliances with major powers across Europe, France, Spain, Milan, Naples. He was obsessed with securing power and wealth for his family, especially his son Cesare, who led papal armies. He was deeply involved in the political and military struggles of Italy.
So very little focus on spiritual matters.
His skills were apparently in administration and diplomacy, but they were almost entirely directed toward secular power and family advancement. It was a papacy defined by political intrigue and scandal. Though it's fair to note, some historians argue Lucrezia's terrible reputation was largely spread by her family's enemies.
Okay. After Alexander VI, there was Pius III, but he was only pope for.
Just 26 days in 1503, no real impact.
Then came Julius II, 1503 to 1513. He sounds different.
Different, but not necessarily focused on spiritual reform. Julius II hated the Borgias and tried to erase their legacy. He was known as the warrior pope.
Warrior pope.
Yeah, his main focus was military, rebuilding and consolidating the Papal States, fighting wars, making alliances, plotting against France. He did have an illegitimate daughter, but didn't promote his family like the Borgias.
But he's also known for art patronage.
Hugely. He commissioned the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica, the massive project we know today, and famously hired Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling.
And how did he pay for all this?
Yeah.
Or is the art?
Now we get to it. Largely through the sale of indulgences. This practice ramped up significantly under Julius to fund these enormous projects. He also founded the Swiss Guard, by the way.
Selling indulgences to pay for St. Peter's. That's going to be important. Did he try any reform?
Under pressure, he did call the Fifth Lateran Council in 1512, but it started late in his papacy and didn't achieve much substantive reform before his death.
Which leads us to the Pope when the Reformation actually breaks out. Leo X, 1513 to 1521. We know he became a cardinal very young.
Yes, Giovanni de' Medici, Leo X. He continued the Fifth Lateran Council Julius started, but again it fizzled out without tackling the really deep-seated problems.
What was his focus?
Leo was known for his lavish lifestyle, his patronage of the arts, a true Renaissance prince. But critics say he was more concerned with Medici family interests in Florence and the pleasures of Rome than with the spiritual health of the church or the growing storm clouds gathering in Germany. He famously is said to have underestimated the initial challenge from Martin Luther.
So looking at these 6 popes, wow, some clear recurring themes emerge. Nepotism is just constant.
Absolutely relentless, placing family, often unqualified, in positions of immense power and wealth. It undermined everything.
And the money. Simony, selling pardons, selling indulgences. The financial corruption seems pervasive.
It really does. A constant drive for funds, often through deeply questionable means, which completely overshadowed spiritual duties.
Plus the sheer moral laxity described in the papal court. Extravagance, acknowledged children.
It created a huge credibility gap. How could leaders living like that preach self-denial or spiritual focus?
And underlying it all is this focus on secular ambitions, the wars, the politics, maintaining the papal states.
That seems central. The role of Pope as Italian prince often seemed more important than Pope as spiritual leader of Christendom.
And despite calls for reform, like from Wycliffe, Huss, the conciliarists, nothing really changed to the top.
Meaningful top-down reform just didn't happen. The Fifth Lateran Council was too little, too late. The vested interests were too strong.
We also touched on how excommunication maybe wasn't the ultimate weapon it once was.
Its effectiveness certainly weakened. As nations grew stronger and politics more complex, rulers were sometimes willing to defy it, especially if they had powerful allies. Think of Henry VIII. Later excommunication didn't stop him.
And the whole concept of anti-popes during the schism must have just confused everyone about who was actually in charge.
It created decades of uncertainty and division, making the papacy look fallible and politically manipulated.
Yet one of our sources, the Crisis magazine piece, makes an interesting point that the church surviving popes like Alexander VI actually points to its divine protection, its indefectibility.
It's a theological argument, certainly, that the institution endures despite the deep flaws of some individuals who lead it. It's a perspective that focuses on the long view of church history.
And finally, that parallel drawn in the Origins article, comparing the handling of moral failings, specifically mentioning sexual abuse concerns around confession back then, to more recent crises.
Yes, it suggests that some of the church's struggles with internal accountability and transparency regarding misconduct have very deep historical roots. The preference for handling things internally rather than involving secular authorities seems to be a long-standing pattern.
It really adds another layer to understanding the climate back then. So pulling it all together, this folly of the papacy, What's the bottom line on how it set the stage for the Reformation?
I think the bottom line is that the deep entanglement of secular power and spiritual authority led to systemic problems.
Hmm.
Rampant corruption like nepotism and simony, a focus on worldly ambition over spiritual needs, and repeated failures to enact meaningful reform.
Which created a disconnect.
A massive disconnect. People lost faith not necessarily in God, but in the institution and its leadership.
Yeah.
The papacy's moral authority was severely weakened by schisms, wars, and scandals. So when Martin Luther and others raised their theological challenges, they found an audience already primed by decades, even centuries, of disillusionment with the way the church was being run. The ground was incredibly fertile for change.
It's such a powerful reminder that history isn't just about abstract ideas. It's about people, power, money, and very human failings. The Reformation wasn't just a theological dispute. It was a reaction to a perceived deep betrayal of the church's own ideals.
Exactly. And maybe the final thought for you, the listener, is this. Think about institutions today, any institution, even those with the highest ideals. How do they balance their mission with the inevitable pressures of power, influence, and resources? This dive into the Renaissance papacy shows how badly things can go wrong when that balance is lost. It's a timeless challenge, isn't it? Something to really ponder as we think about leadership and integrity in any era.